The wind had a voice that night, a wild, howling cry that clawed at the lonely cabin perched on the edge of the Wyoming plains. Snow came down in furious waves, smothering every sound except the roar of the blizzard. Inside, Eleanor Price pressed another log into the wood stove and watched the embers flare. The storm didn't frighten her. She had weathered dozens alone. What unsettled her was the ache of silence between each gust, the kind of silence that reminded her how long it had been since anyone had said her name with warmth. She sat in her father's old rocking chair, mending a torn blanket by lamplight, her needle steady despite the wind shaking the walls. 40 years old now, she had grown used to solitude. The people in Bitter Creek had long stopped calling on her, whispering behind her back about Miss Price and her quiet ways. She didn't mind anymore. The world outside her cabin felt like another life entirely, one that had forgotten her dot. Then came the knock dot at first. She thought it was the wind slamming a loose shutter. But then it came again, 3 firm raps against the wooden door. Her heart kicked hard in her chest. No one came this far out in weather like this. She reached for her father's old rifle by the door and lifted the latch just an inch. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling more from surprise than fear. Through the crack, snowflakes blew in, and a deep, rough voice answered, "Name's Luke Weston, ma'am. My horse went down in the storm. I need shelter, just till morning." Eleanor hesitated. She could barely make out his shape, a tall man wrapped in a worn duster, snow crusted over his hat and shoulders. His face was shadowed, but his tone was steady, respectful. She had been alone so long that even the sound of another voice made her chest tighten. "Are you armed?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," he said honestly. "But I'll lay it down soon as I step inside." For a moment, she warred with herself. Letting a stranger in could be dangerous. Yet something in his voice, steady but tired, a little desperate, made her nod before she even realized it. She unlatched the door and pulled it open. A gust of icy wind burst through, nearly blowing out the lamp. Luke stumbled inside, snow melting off his coat in rivulets. He was younger than she expected, maybe late 30s. Though the lines around his eyes told of a man who'd seen more than his share of hard roads. "Thank you." "Ma'am," he said, setting his revolver carefully on the table. "Didn't mean to startle you." Eleanor shut the door and leaned her back against it, catching her breath. "No one comes out this way in a storm. You're lucky you made it." "I reckon luck's all that's kept me alive tonight," he said with a faint, grateful smile. She gestured toward the fire. "Warm yourself. I'll fetch some coffee." As he knelt by the stove, thawing his hands, Eleanor studied him quietly. His coat was torn at the shoulder, boots caked in ice, hat battered from the wind. Yet there was something steady in his presence. Something that filled the cabin with a strange warmth she hadn't felt in years. When she handed him the steaming tin cup, their fingers brushed for an instant, brief, accidental. But it was enough to send a flutter through her chest. Like the first spark catching in a cold hearth. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, 2 strangers sat across from each other in the dim golden light, one seeking shelter from the snow, the other unaware that her long winter of loneliness had just begun to thaw. By morning, the storm had buried the world outside in a white silence. Snow stretched across the plains like an endless sea, swallowing every path, every sign of life. When Eleanor pulled open the door, a rush of cold air swept in and made her gasp. The drifts reached halfway up the porch steps. There'd be no traveling for days, maybe weeks. Luke Weston stood behind her, quiet but alert, his hat in hand. He had already stacked more firewood by the stove and cleaned his boots by the door without being asked. She noticed that small courtesy and filed it away silently. "Looks like the storm's done its worst," he said. His voice low and rough, still tinged with sleep. Eleanor nodded, tightening the shawl around her shoulders. "You won't be riding out any time soon." "I figured," he said. "If it's all the same to you, ma'am, I'll stay until the trail's clear. I'll pull my weight-fix fences, chop wood, whatever needs doing." Her eyes flickered to him sharply. Having a man under her roof, even a decent-seeming one, felt improper, dangerous, maybe even foolish. For 20 years she'd guarded her independence like a shield. Men had come and gone from town, all with talk and charm and hungry eyes. She had no use for that kind of company anymore, but this man didn't look like he wanted anything from her except a roof and a chance to rest. His face was tired, lined with the kind of sorrow only hard years could carve. "You'll work for your keep," she said finally. "I can't afford a freeloader." Luke smiled faintly. "Wouldn't dream of it, Miss Price." The way he said her name startled her, soft, respectful, but familiar somehow, like he'd been saying it for years. She busied herself with the kettle to hide the heat rising in her cheeks. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Luke rose early, cutting firewood and clearing the path to the barn. His horse, a gray named Jasper, limped from the fall but healed slowly under Eleanor's care. In the evenings they shared supper beans, cornbread, whatever she had stored for winter. They spoke little, but the silence wasn't sharp. It was steady, almost companionable. Still, Eleanor kept her guard. When he offered to mend the roof, she watched from the window, rifle leaning by the door, just in case. When he asked if she needed help carrying water, she refused at first. Stubborn pride outweighing reason. Yet, with each passing day, her resistance softened a little. Luke never pried, never asked about her life or why she lived so far from town. He didn't flirt or make her uneasy. He simply existed beside her, a quiet presence that filled the cabin with a kind of peace she hadn't realized she missed. One evening, as she darned socks by the fire, she caught him looking at an old photograph on the mantel, her father in his uniform, her mother in her Sunday best, and a much younger Eleanor between them. "You were just a girl," he said softly. "Pretty smile." She paused mid-stitch, a wave of discomfort washing through her. Compliments weren't something she knew what to do with anymore. "That was a long time ago," she murmured. He nodded. "Still looks like you." The words hung in the air, simple but disarming. She pretended not to hear and returned to her sewing, though her hands trembled slightly. When she went to bed that night, she stared at the ceiling long after the fire went out. Having someone else's footsteps echo in her home, the creak of another bed, the sound of quiet breathing from the next room, it all felt foreign, but not unwelcome. For years, she had believed her life was set quiet, solitary, sealed off from the world. But now, with the snow still deep and a stranger under her roof, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of something dangerous and tender. She didn't yet call it hope, but she feared it might be. The days began to slip into a rhythm, quiet as snowfall. Each morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of movement in the yard, the steady chop of Luke's axe, the creak of the barn door, the soft murmur of his voice talking to the horses. It startled her how quickly she'd grown used to that sound. For years her mornings had begun in silence, broken only by the wind or the cry of a distant hawk. Now there was a living presence outside her window, shaping her days without asking permission. Luke worked with the patience of a man who knew hard labor well. He mended fences, cleared snow from the roof, and fixed the sagging porch steps that had creaked for years. He never waited to be told what to do, just saw what needed doing and did it. Eleanor found herself watching from the window, her hands paused in the dishwater as he bent to his work. There was strength in his movements, but gentleness too, a steadiness that made her chest tighten in ways she didn't understand. She told herself it was only gratitude, nothing more. When they spoke, it was only about the day's work, the weather, the animals, the woodpile. Luke didn't talk much, and Eleanor preferred it that way. Yet his silences were never awkward. They carried a calmness, like he wasn't afraid of quiet the way other men were. In the evenings after supper, he'd sometimes hum under his breath low cowboy tunes, half-forgotten ballads from the trail. She pretended not to listen, but the sound followed her even when she went to bed. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Luke came in from chopping wood, snow dusting his shoulders. "Fence by the creek's near ready," he said, wiping his hands. She nodded from her seat by the stove. "You've done more in 2 weeks than I could manage in 2 years. He shrugged. "Gives me something to do. Can't sit still too long. Never been good at idleness." Eleanor gave a small smile, faint but genuine. "Then we're alike in that." The moment passed quietly, but it stayed with her. It had been so long since anyone had shared her pace, simple, steady work, no rush, no noise. Most men who visited her farm had come to take something: eggs, wool, sometimes favors she would never give. But Luke gave back more than he took. He brought warmth into the house just by existing in it. That night, while they ate stew by the fire, Eleanor caught him watching the flames with a distant expression. "You thinking of home?" she asked before she could stop herself. He hesitated. "I had a place once," he said softly. "Wife, too. She got sick. After that, there wasn't much reason to stay." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." He gave a quiet nod, eyes still fixed on the fire. "Been drifting ever since. Guess the road don't feel so empty when you've got work to do." They said nothing more after that. But when he rose to clear the dishes, Eleanor felt a strange ache in her chest. Sympathy, yes, but also something deeper, something like recognition. They were both ghosts of their former selves. Living among memories and silence. As the weeks passed, she began leaving small kindnesses for him without thinking. Fresh bread on the table. Mended gloves. Extra coffee in the morning. He noticed, though he never mentioned it. Only smiled sometimes, that quiet, grateful smile that unsettled her heart more than any words could. The snow outside began to soften under the first weak hints of spring. The world was slowly thawing, and though Eleanor didn't dare name it, so was she. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It had turned into something gentle, almost sacred. A quiet language of shared mornings and unspoken longing. And for the first time in years, Eleanor began to look forward to each new day. Winter still held the land in its grip, though the days were growing longer. The snow melted a little faster under the noon sun, the wind lost some of its bite, and sometimes, if Eleanor stood outside long enough, she could hear the faint trickle of water running beneath the ice. It was a small sound, but to her, it felt like the earth itself was beginning to breathe again. Yet inside her, the thaw came slower. Each day she spent with Luke made something stir in her chest, something both tender and frightening. He was patient, good with his hands, steady as the land itself. He never overstepped, never pried. But his quiet kindness began to wear down the walls she had built over decades of solitude. And when she caught herself smiling at the sight of him coming in from the cold, or listening too long to the rumble of his voice, she would retreat to her room, shut the door, and scold herself for feeling like a foolish girl again. One night, as she sat sewing by lamplight, her eyes drifted to a small box on the mantel. The wooden lid was worn smooth from years of touch. Inside lay a single keepsake, a simple gold ring. Dulled with age, she hadn't looked at it in years. The man who gave it to her, Thomas Braden, had been charming, handsome, full of promises. They'd been engaged when Eleanor was barely 20, and for a time she'd believed love would be enough to protect her from gossip and judgment. But the night before their wedding, Thomas had pressed for what she couldn't give. When she refused, he'd turned cold, accused her of being frigid, unnatural. The next day, he was gone along with the future she dreamed of. After that, Eleanor had built her walls tall and unyielding. The townsfolk had whispered, 40 and never wed. Strange woman, that Miss Price. But she stopped listening. Better loneliness than betrayal. Better silence than shame. She thought she had buried that part of herself long ago. But now, as she glanced at Luke bent over the fire, his broad shoulders glowing amber in the lamplight, the memory of that ring burned like a brand. She touched the scar on her heart where love had once lived and wondered. For the first time in decades, if she'd been wrong to let it die. That same night, she caught Luke sitting outside on the porch, staring at the horizon where the stars cut sharp against the black sky. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out. "You'll freeze," she said softly. He looked up at her with a faint, crooked smile. "I've known colder nights." She sat beside him, cautious at first. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, as if carried by the wind itself, Luke said, "My wife used to sit out with me like this. She loved the stars. Sod they reminded her that there's light even in the darkest sky." Eleanor turned to him, her throat tight. She must have been a fine woman. "She was," he said simply. "Cancer took her. Left me with too much silence." The grief in his voice was quiet but deep, like a river running under ice. Eleanor didn't reach out or offer pity. She only sat beside him, the distance between them small but powerful. The night felt heavy with all the things neither could say, for the first time. They saw each other not as strangers sharing a cabin, but as two souls bound by the same ache-loss, loneliness, the quiet hunger for something they both thought was gone forever. Inside, the fire crackled. Outside, the snow felt softer now, gentler. And as the stars shone above them, Eleanor wondered if the past had finally loosened its grip or if it was only waiting to test her heart again. The next morning dawned cold but bright, the kind of sharp, glass-clear day that only came after a heavy storm. The world outside glittered with frost. The trees shimmered like glass. Inside the cabin, Eleanor was kneeling by the stove, stirring the morning porridge while Luke split kindling outside. She had begun to anticipate his routines as surely as she knew her own, where he would hang his hat, when he'd bring in firewood, how he always whistled softly before stepping through the door so as not to startle her. But that morning, her concentration slipped. She'd been up half the night, restless with thoughts she couldn't quiet. Her hand drifted too close to the iron kettle, and before she realized it, the handle slipped and boiling water splashed across her wrist. She gasped and dropped the spoon. Pain seared through her arm. The door burst open a second later. Luke stood there, snow still on his boots, eyes wide. "Eleanor, what happened?" "Nothing," she hissed through gritted teeth, clutching her wrist. "Just a little burn." He crossed the room in 3 long strides. "Let me see." "I said it's fine," she muttered, embarrassed by the sudden heat in her face. But he was already gently taking her arm, his touch firm yet careful. When she tried to pull away, he only shook his head slightly. "Hold still." His voice was quiet but commanding. He guided her to the table, then poured cool water from the basin over her skin. She winced, but the pain eased a little. His hands were rough and calloused, the hands of a man used to hard work, yet his touch was astonishingly gentle. "I've had my share of burns," he murmured. "Used to help my wife with the cook fire. You'll be fine." At the mention of his wife, Eleanor's heart gave a strange, soft twist. She studied his face as he worked, his brow furrowed in focus, his jaw shadowed with stubble. He tied a clean cloth around her wrist, his fingers brushing her skin. When their eyes met, she felt her breath catch. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, faint but warm. "You don't have to thank me for that." For a moment, neither of them moved. The cabin seemed to still, as if the world itself had paused to watch them. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant whinny of Luke's horse outside. Eleanor suddenly became acutely aware of how close he was. The smell of leather and smoke clinging to his coat. The quiet steadiness in his gaze. She pulled her hand back, flustered. "I'll be fine now." Luke nodded, stepping away. "Still let me take over the cooking for today." "You can rest." "That's not necessary," she began, but he was already reaching for the ladle with an easy grin. "You've done enough feeding me these past weeks. My turn." Against her better judgment, Eleanor laughed a sound that startled her as much as it did him. It had been so long since laughter had come easily. The rest of the day passed differently after that. Luke cooked with surprising skill, teasing lightly when the porridge turned too thick, and Eleanor found herself smiling more than she wanted to admit. Her wrist throbbed now and then, but the pain seemed distant, softened by the warmth of his care. That night, as she lay in bed, she kept thinking of the way he had held her hand so gently, as if she were something precious. No man had ever touched her like that, not even the one who had once promised to love her. It frightened her, that tenderness. But it also lit something small and bright inside her chest, a fragile ember she hadn't felt in decades. She turned onto her side, staring into the dark. Somewhere in the next room, Luke's low hum drifted through the quiet. It was the same tune he always hummed before sleep. A soft western lullaby that made her heart ache in ways she couldn't name. For the first time in years, Eleanor fell asleep smiling. By March, the sharpest bite of winter had softened. The wind that once howled like a beast now came as a low hum through the cottonwoods. The snow still covered the ground, but patches of brown earth had begun to peek through. Smelling faintly of damp soil and new beginnings, Eleanor felt the change in her bones before she saw it in the world around her. Something inside her was loosening, too, a long frozen stillness beginning to stir. The days with Luke had settled into an easy rhythm that no longer felt strange. They worked side by side without needing many words. He would mend the fence while she gathered the last of the winter stores. Sometimes they shared small jokes, the kind that weren't really funny but made them laugh anyway. He had a way of smiling that made the room feel warmer, and though she tried to ignore it, her eyes found him more often than she wanted to admit. Luke had changed too. The weariness that had clung to him when he first arrived seemed to be melting away. He whistled more, sang softly as he worked, and sometimes even teased her about her army of cats, or her stubborn habit of fixing things twice before admitting they were fine. She would huff and mock annoyance, but secretly, she liked the way his laughter filled the space between them. One morning, he asked her to step outside. "Sun's out," he said, grinning. "World's still frozen, but the air feels almost alive again." She hesitated at the door, her shawl tight around her shoulders. "You've seen plenty of winters, Luke Weston. You don't need me to tell you when spring's coming." "Maybe not," he said, "but it's better with company." She followed him out, her boots crunching in the snow. The sunlight made the world shimmer like glass. Luke pointed toward the ridge, where the stream had begun to run again beneath the melting ice. The sound of it, soft, steady, was like a heartbeat returning to the land. "Feels like hope," he murmured. Eleanor looked at him, startled by the word, hope. It was a small, fragile thing, and yet hearing it made her throat tighten. "Hope can be dangerous," she said. "It makes people expect more than the world can give." Luke smiled faintly. "Or maybe it just makes people brave enough to try again." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the sun spilling gold over the snow. Then, without quite meaning to, she said, "Would you like to ride today? The Mari's restless. She hasn't been out in months." He looked at her, surprised, and then nodded. "I'd like that." They saddled the horses together, their movements practiced and wordless. Eleanor hadn't ridden since her father died, but with Luke nearby, she felt steadier. When he offered his hand to help her mount, she hesitated, then took it. His hand was warm, solid. They rode slowly across the field, the air crisp and clean. The rhythm of the horses' hooves echoed in the stillness, and for once, Eleanor felt something she hadn't in decades, free. The wind tugged at her hair, and she laughed, the sound surprising even herself. Luke turned toward her, eyes bright. "There it is," he said softly. "I was starting to wonder what your laugh sounded like." Her cheeks flushed. "It's been a long time since anyone gave me reason to use it." He didn't answer, but the look he gave her said enough. When they returned to the cabin, twilight was falling. Luke helped her down, his hands resting a heartbeat too long at her waist before letting go. For the rest of the evening, neither mentioned it, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It hummed with something quiet, something new, something that felt like the first warmth of spring after a long, bitter cold. And Eleanor, though she would never have dared to say it aloud, began to wonder. Perhaps hope wasn't as dangerous as she once thought. By late March, the thaw had truly begun. The days stretched longer, the nights gentler, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and meltwater. For the first time in months, Eleanor left the cabin door open while she worked. The breeze that slipped in felt like a guest itself, fresh, curious, alive. Luke had been restless that day. She'd noticed him pacing near the barn, fiddling with tools that didn't need fixing. When she asked if something was wrong, he only smiled, said he was thinking on a surprise, and disappeared again. As dusk fell, Eleanor was setting the supper table when she caught sight of him through the window. He was outside in the open field, clearing a patch of snow with his shovel. At first, she thought he was simply making room for the horses, but then she realized he was sweeping a circle, neat and wide, beneath the moonlight. "Luke Weston," she called through the door, amused. "Have you lost your senses?" He looked up, eyes bright with mischief. "Not yet. But I might if you don't come out here." She folded her arms. "And do what?" "Dance," he said simply. She froze. The word hit her like a memory. She hadn't danced since she was 20, since the night before everything in her life had come undone. She had sworn never to make herself foolish like that again. "I don't dance," she said. Luke walked toward her slowly, his boots crunching over snow. "Neither do I," he said softly, stopping a few feet away. "But I figure we could learn." The warmth in his smile undid her more than any sweet talk could. Against all sense, she stepped out into the cold, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders. He extended a hand. "May I?" For a long heartbeat she hesitated, then placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers curled around hers, rough and sure. The world around them went quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. There was no music, only the faint whisper of the thawing earth, the soft creak of snow beneath their boots. Luke guided her gently, one arm around her waist, moving slow and steady, as though afraid she might vanish if he held her too close. Eleanor's heart pounded in a way it hadn't for decades. Her steps were clumsy at first, but Luke only laughed, steadying her. "You're a natural," he teased. She shook her head, smiling despite herself. "You're a terrible liar." "Maybe," he said, "but I like the way you move." The moonlight silvered his face, softened the edges of the man she thought she'd come to know. Beneath the stubble and trail-worn lines, she saw something vulnerable, a quiet longing that mirrored her own. As they turned slowly, her shawl slipped and his hand caught it before it fell. His fingers brushed the back of her neck, warm against her skin. She looked up and their eyes locked. In that moment, the years fell away. She was no longer the lonely woman the town pitied, nor he the wandering cowboy haunted by loss. They were simply two souls who had found each other by accident, two people standing in the middle of a snowfield, hearts thawing faster than the land around them. Luke's voice broke the silence. "You know, Eleanor, I reckon this is the first time I felt peace in a long while." She swallowed hard. Then don't let go, she whispered. They didn't kiss, not yet. The world wasn't ready for that kind of promise. But as they swayed beneath the pale moon, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, Eleanor knew something had shifted forever. When they finally stepped apart, the snow beneath them was stamped with their footprints, a circle of warmth carved into the cold. That night, as she lay awake listening to the soft creak of the cabin walls, Eleanor realized she no longer feared the quiet, because now every silence held his laughter, his steady voice, and the memory of a dance she would never forget. The snow had nearly vanished by early April, leaving the ground soft and muddy, the air rich with the scent of thawed earth. Birds returned to the trees, and sunlight streamed through the cabin windows in wide golden beams. Spring was coming, but with it came the quiet ache of knowing that winter's shelter and all it had brought was coming to an end. Eleanor felt it before Luke ever said a word. He'd been quieter these past few days, spending longer hours near the barn or the fence line, repairing what didn't truly need fixing. When she asked if something was wrong, he only said, "Just making sure I leave things better than I found them." The words lodged like a stone in her chest. That evening, the mail wagon came down the ridge for the first time since winter. Luke went out to meet it, returning with a single envelope, creased and dusted from the long trail. Eleanor watched from the doorway as he turned the letter over in his hands, his jaw tight. "Bad news?" she asked softly when he came inside. He hesitated, then handed it to her. "From a friend down in Texas, ranch foreman I used to ride with. Says there's work waiting if I want it." Eleanor's hands went still. "Work," she repeated. "So you'll be leaving." He nodded slowly. "Come spring proper, I reckon. 6 months shelter was the deal, and you've been more than generous." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thinner. She turned back to the stove, stirring a pot that no longer needed stirring. "You don't owe me anything, Luke. You've earned your keep 10 times over." "That's not what I mean," he said gently. "You've given me something I didn't expect to find again. Peace. A place that feels like home." Her hands trembled, though she kept them busy. "Home isn't for people like us," she said. "You've got a road to follow, and I've got this place. It's enough." He stepped closer. "Is it?" She froze as his voice softened. "Eleanor, I know what folks in town say. I know you've spent your life alone. But I also know you're not made for loneliness. You were just waiting for someone to see you." Her throat tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Luke's eyes didn't waver. "You've never been with anyone, have you?" The air left her lungs in a sharp gasp. "How dare you?" He shook his head quickly, his tone tender. "I didn't mean it to shame you. I can see it. You hold the world like you're afraid it'll break if you touch it. And you shouldn't have to." For a long, fragile moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled low, shadows flickering between them. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she could feel it echo in her fingertips. Finally, she whispered, "You're right. I never found a man worth giving that to." Her voice faltered. "Not until now." Luke's eyes softened. He stepped forward, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint scent of cedar and leather. "You deserve more than what the world's given you, Eleanor. And I'd stay if I thought I could give it. But I've got debts, places that still call my name. I'd only hold you back." Tears pricked her eyes, though she blinked them away. "Then don't promise me things you can't keep." He lifted a hand, brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "I won't," he said. "But I will promise you this. I'll remember this place. And the woman who made me believe again." Then, as if afraid another word would ruin it, he pressed his lips to her forehead, soft, reverent, lingering. When he stepped back, neither could speak. The letter lay forgotten on the table, but its meaning hung heavy in the air. Outside, The last snow melted into the earth, and with it, Eleanor felt something melt inside her too, not her hope, but her illusion that the heart could stay untouched forever. The dawn he chose to leave broke soft and gray, the kind of morning that looked half asleep, unwilling to face the day. A low fog hung over the fields, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. Eleanor stood by the window, her shawl wrapped tightly around her, watching Luke saddle his horse in the pale light. He moved with the same quiet efficiency he always did, measured, calm, purposeful, but every motion carried a heaviness she hadn't seen before. She knew this moment was coming. He had told her 2 nights ago that he would ride out when the trails cleared. She had nodded, keeping her face composed, her voice steady. Yet inside, something fragile had cracked open, spilling ache into every corner of her chest. She had spent the night awake, listening to the rhythmic creak of the wind against the cabin walls. Each sound reminded her of the simple life they had shared, the scrape of his boots by the door, the soft hum of his tune before sleep, the warmth that had filled a space once haunted by silence. And now, the thought of returning to that silence felt unbearable. When he stepped inside to gather his things, a worn saddlebag, his hat, the letter from Texas still folded in his coat, Eleanor forced herself to smile. "You'll make good time if you leave now," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. Luke looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I was hoping you wouldn't say that." She tried to joke, though it came out hollow. "What else would you have me say? That I'll chase you down the trail?" He smiled faintly, but his eyes held no amusement. "I'd stay if I thought I could give you the life you deserve." "You already gave me more than that," she said quietly. "You gave me warmth when I'd forgotten what it felt like." They stood facing each other in the small cabin, the fire burning low behind them. Outside, the fog pressed close to the windows like a ghost listening in. "Eleanor," he said, stepping closer, "I need you to know something before I go." She lifted her chin, though tears already pricked her eyes. "What is it?" He hesitated, his voice rough when he spoke. "If things were different, if I were a man who could settle, if the road didn't keep calling, I'd ask you to let me stay. Because this—" He reached out, his hand brushing her cheek. "This feels like home." Her breath hitched. For a heartbeat, she let her face rest against his palm, memorizing the warmth of it. "Then don't go," she whispered, the words trembling out before she could stop them. He closed his eyes. "You know I have to." Silence fell between them, thick and heavy. Then, slowly, she reached for him. "Then at least don't leave me wondering," she said. Luke leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "I wouldn't dare." Their lips met softly at first, hesitant, as though both feared the moment might break if they pressed too hard. But then his arms drew her close, and the kiss deepened, gentle, yet aching with everything they hadn't said. It wasn't a promise of forever, but of something real, something that had changed them both. When he pulled back, she could see tears glistening at the corners of his eyes. "You take care of yourself, Eleanor Price," he said, his voice thick. She smiled through her tears. "You too, Luke Weston." He turned then, placing his hat on his head, and stepped into the morning fog. She stood in the doorway, watching as he mounted his horse and rode away, the sound of hooves fading into the hush of the waking world. Only when he disappeared beyond the ridge did she let herself cry quietly, fiercely, without shame. Inside, the fire flickered weakly, throwing light on the empty chair he'd always favored. It looked as though he might walk back in at any moment. Eleanor sank into it, clutching the shawl around her, and whispered to the silence, "Goodbye, my cowboy." Outside, the fog began to lift, and a thin ray of sunlight broke through the gray, spilling across the field where his tracks led away, fading slowly, but never completely gone. 6 months passed, and autumn came quietly to the valley. The days grew shorter again, the fields golden with dying grass, and the air crisp with the promise of winter's return. For Eleanor, the seasons no longer marked survival, they marked memory. Each change in the light, each chill in the wind, carried whispers of a man who had left footprints not only in the snow, but deep in her heart. The cabin looked the same from the outside, though the woman who lived within it was not. She moved with steadier purpose now, her loneliness softened into something gentler, not gone, but no longer sharp. She still rose before dawn to tend the chickens, still split wood for the fire, but she no longer avoided the spaces that reminded her of him. The chair he favored now sat by the window with a blanket folded neatly over the back. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of evening, she'd sit there with her sewing and imagine his voice beside her. Low and warm. Word of Luke Weston had trickled back through the post in midsummer, a short note, carried by a ranch hand passing through town. It said he was well, working steady, earning honest pay, planning to head north come fall. There was no promise, no confession, just a few lines in a hand she'd learned to recognize even in a storm. But to Eleanor, that single note was enough to turn her days brighter. Still, there were nights when she stood at the door, looking out over the ridge, wondering if she'd ever see him again. The land stretched endlessly before her, wide and wild, and she knew somewhere out there he was riding beneath the same stars. Then, one late afternoon in October, as she stacked the last of the firewood for winter, she heard it, the distant rhythm of hooves against hard ground. She froze, her breath catching. It might have been a traveler or a rancher heading to town, but something in the steady, familiar cadence made her heart race. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out into the yard. The setting sun burned low across the sky, painting everything in gold. And then, through the haze, she saw him. Luke rode up slow, his hat low over his brow, dust on his coat and weariness in his eyes. But when he saw her, that slow, unmistakable smile spread across his face, the same one that had melted her fear months ago. "Afternoon, Miss Price," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was rougher now, but full of warmth. Eleanor's throat tightened. "You came back. Promised I'd remember you," he said softly. Turns out remembering wasn't enough. She didn't move at first, afraid if she did, the moment might vanish like a dream. But when he dismounted and stepped toward her, the last of her restraint broke. "I thought you were gone for good," she whispered. He looked down at her, eyes shining. "Tried to be. Didn't take." And then she was in his arms, no hesitation this time, no fear of what the world might say. The months apart had stripped them both of doubt. The kiss they shared was deep, certain, filled with everything they had left unspoken. When they finally drew apart, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "6 months on the trail, and all I could think about was you in that cabin," he said. "Figured I'd better come back before another cowboy got smart enough to do the same." Eleanor laughed through tears, the sound catching in the cool evening air. "No one else would have waited out that winter," she said. "No one but you." He grinned. "Then I reckon I'll stay through the next one, if you'll have me." She didn't answer in words, only took his hand and led him toward the cabin, the firelight flickering through the windows like a beacon. That night, as the wind rose outside, the sound of laughter and quiet conversation drifted through the walls. And though the snow would soon return, the little cabin no longer stood as a place of solitude. It had become what it was always meant to be, a home, shared between two hearts that had finally found their way back.